These words come from Venice Williams, a Black minister, organizer, and facilitator. You are awakening to the same country you fell asleep to, the very same country. Pull yourself together. And when you see me, do not ask me, what do we do now? How do we get through the next 4 years? Some of my ancestors dealt with the last 400 years of this under worse conditions. Continue to do the good work. Continue to build bridges, not walls. Continue to lead with compassion. Continue the demanding work of liberation for all. Continue to dismantle broken systems, large and small. Continue to set the best example for the children. Continue to be a vessel of nourishing joy. Continue right where you are, right where you live, into your days. Do so in the name of the Creator who expects nothing less than that from each of us. And if you are not continuing all of the above in community, partnership, collaboration, what is it you have been doing? What is it you are waiting for? I hope you're all strapped in because I have a lot to say this morning and I'm running out of time. Last week, I preached on love in a time of fascism, and this is part 2. I spent time last week outlining Jason Stanley's 10 fascist political tactics. These cannot easily or fully be isolated from each other. That is, they feed off of and into each other. And when there are multiples of them in use together and they promote division or othering, they are being used for fascism. These tactics are spelled out in Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. The 10 are a mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, Sodom and Gomorrah, urban versus rural, and Arbeit macht frei. Work shall make you free. Othering through standards and ideals about what work looks like, including tearing into labor unions that bring people together across class. I ended the sermon with questions like these. How can we be the loving people we believe ourselves to be while holding firm in our resistance to fascism and those who spread it? What does love ask us to do? How do we live our values? I mentioned my resistance to delving into this topic. The resistance wasn't intellectual. This has been a big part of my education. The resistance was spiritual and emotional, personal even. In its most simple terms, I didn't want to remember that these others who cause so much harm to people I love are not only human, but are mine, ours. It is difficult to want to humanize or rehumanize those who so vehemently dehumanize us and those we love. It is easier when we other each other and treat one another as less than, to be physically, emotionally, verbally abusive, to strip them of their dignity and worth in our minds. You're not a bad person if you do this. You're just human. We all do it at times. We want to other. It's a natural response. Othering, however, can come with its own sense of superiority, the idea that because I am not like them, such as I'm actually a law-abiding citizen and never have been convicted of a crime, unlike our president-elect, that makes me a better person. We reduce one another to one-dimensional outlines based on one moment in time, possibly our worst. And importantly, when our emotions are beyond a 10-point scale, when the low-grade frustrations have been building up to that for weeks, months, and years without recognition or being addressed. I'm not saying that the rise of fascism isn't the fault of Trump supporters and that it's ours. Fascism emerges in unhealthy systems where disconnect and division are ready to be exploited. Terrorist cells or any number of extremist functions in the same way. These groups are able to attract those who are feeling othered, vulnerable for whatever reason, and who are seeking connection. They find that connection in a group that allows them to feel not only a sense of belonging, but also a sense of power. There's a podcast from years ago from NPR's Invisibilia that talked about a Denmark town's idea of combating and even possibly preventing violent extremism and terrorism by attempting to make sure that potential recruits got the care and support that they would need to keep them from getting involved. For example, counseling may be offered to young people, especially young men and their families. They connected young people with mentors and other such measures. That is, their basic strategy for trying to prevent extremism and terrorism was the radical idea that being in relationship, that being connected in meaningful ways with others would help people become socially integrated in their communities. It is much harder to radicalize people who have people in their lives, their neighborhoods, their schools, their workplaces, and so on, who care for them and who they care about. This strategy of connecting or reconnecting people with their community or communities is based on awareness of how certain trends are colliding and harming individuals. Social isolationism has been on the rise for generations, especially with the decline of third spaces like churches and other religious centers being a big one. The absence of public spaces where people meet and gather reinforces isolationism, as has the disappearance of big porches from homes, neighborhood gatherings, community centers, and other spaces. Like others, Danes probably thought their greatest threats came from without. What they began to understand was that it came from within, that the isolated in their communities were being recruited into extremist groups that would return them to carry out violence in their own communities where they felt they had been betrayed or left behind. Tribalism, the drive to find people like me or us, may not be so much on the rise as more prominent now. When we don't have other circumstances that may force us, to an extent, to be in relationship with our neighbors and others, we gravitate toward those with similar interests and identities in a lot of cases. This can just reinforce our isolationism or create a kind of echo chamber. Social media and various apps and sites like YouTube can also reinforce this by catering to our particular algorithms. Then we get to see more of what we like, creating a vacuum of what we're being exposed to. And the news cycle turns over at a wild rate anymore. We consume so much news and data that it's harder to stay focused on what's important. And we are completely overwhelmed, which keeps us immobilized mentally and emotionally, which, by the way, is a strategy in and of itself. There are so many problems in the world, and so many of them are so big that one person can't do much, and we also get stuck in this loop of too big, too much, too big, too much, too big, too much. Throw in a heaping dose of polite conversation that forbids topics of sex, politics, or religion, and finally add the tactics of fascist politics on top of the existing wildly frayed social fabric, and all of these elements and how we got to where we are becomes a bit clearer. All of these reinforce an idea of us versus them, however we choose to define the us and the them at any given moment. This is when othering takes deeper root and we distance ourselves with our words and our actions. The only way to counteract this is to recreate a healthy and strong social fabric that allows, at first, casual but necessary interaction. Humans are wired for connection. We need to be able to reconnect with one another's basic humanity. The ideology of exclusion and othering must be undone. This can be really hard to do. I struggle all the time with wanting to know about people who I already know have different political values and ideals than I do, especially when those beliefs harm myself or the people I love. And this is quite possibly the most critical work we can be doing now. It will be the work of a generation or more to help us get to a better place as a country, if It's even possible. It may well save us from the civil war looming. I've truly come to believe or re-believe that our healing will only come if we set aside the political challenges and address the deeper spiritual ones. We keep doing the things that we're doing, supporting democracy and those who share our values, advocating for change that helps all of us, showing up in public forums, but we also need to dig into this realm. Following the Reverend Cecilia Kingman's amazing Berry Street essay delivered at our 2023 General Assembly, My Little Pony Was Right, Fascism's Without and Within, there were 2 respondents. The first, which she described as a dispatch from behind enemy lines, was the Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Stevens, who serves the UU Church of the Palouse in Moscow, Idaho. That congregation, in an even redder state than Florida, has been working hard in their community to try to make changes. Their simple guiding principle has been to do good and live our UU values out loud, as she says, because it's really hard to hate people you know. Their congregation has been thriving despite the repressive extremists in government and the community. They have worked to become beacons of our faith, while also being beacons of a new way of being together. Their church is so well known, Stephen says, that everyone in their town knows who they are and what they stand for. They are committed to the high stakes fights that they find themselves in, not the fake fights that our congregations can fall into. They're focused on the fights about democracy and abortion and education. Their conversations in church are about how to leverage their privilege in their community to advocate for and create change, and how to be there for one another when the fascists come for them. Some have already been participating in civil disobedience. Those who can keep trying to build bridges with members of a local extremist group because they are their neighbors. They take casseroles when medical and other needs arise and shovel driveways when it snows. This is not meant to be the work of those who are on the receiving end of harm or those targeted for othering by a group. It is a way to harness our privilege for those of us who have it in order to make change. Resistance also takes the shape of resting, celebrating, and living well, keeping local culture alive and thriving. Resistance is celebrating love with birthdays and anniversaries, going to the theater, supporting our local parks, or telling stories about people who look and love and live differently than the one-dimensional cookie-cutter stories we're told are acceptable. There's a way, if we practice it, of living our values and honoring the inherent worth and dignity of all people. We don't have to agree on everything, and most likely will not. But we do not want to sacrifice anyone's humanity, as it is inextricably bound up with our own. Both Rabbis Sharon Blouse and Danya Ruttenberg, whose respective books, The Amen Effect and On Repentance and Repair, have shared the story of Derek Black, the son of the founder of Stormfront, a white nationalist online community and godson of former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke. Black had been called the heir apparent of the white nationalist movement. He had his own radio show and youth Stormfront online community. He taught people in communities here in Florida how to win election using white nationalist talking points without being explicitly white nationalist or racist, helping create the wave that Trump has been able to ride to the White House. It was when he went to university at New College that he started to experience people from other backgrounds. Black even made some diverse friends there, including a few Jews who eventually invited him to their Shabbat dinners. These Jews had learned about Black's identity as a white nationalist and chose to try to engage him and help him think differently. For them, this was not only activism, it was a way to participate in some of the hardest work fighting for all of our civil rights. They knew they needed to be in it for the long game, and so they invited him back week after week. Black was curious and listened. They all got to know each other, and eventually those Jews who had initially been scared of what might happen began to return. They talked about different areas of interest, from history to language and other topics, without broaching the subjects of politics, racism, or nationalism. Eventually, Black was exposed to enough ideas that he had trouble continuing to make sense of this world that he had been born into. They said things like, "Help me understand," or "Using your own words, what does this mean to you?" Or, "Wow, where did you get that information? I'd like to read more about that." Gentle questions that might help begin to raise some doubts. If you have more time or capacity, other strategies that can be used together. Clarify or paraphrase what the other person is saying to make sure that you understand. This helps keep you curious. Try to find some common ground, even something like, "These last 4 years have really been difficult for all of us." If the other person might be open to it, try pivoting, which can be disagreeing or even just adding nuance or a different perspective. Offer a personal story or experience if you can, not facts, and especially if you're able to share how things may be hurting you. An alternative is to ask questions about things that you find concerning to see if there's common ground to further build on and explain where you're coming from. Those feelings and emotions that we've been talking about, that's where we have the most opportunity to meet. Changing hearts changes minds. Derek Black isn't the only one who has had this experience of having his views change dramatically. Other former white nationalists, Christian nationalists, and others have as well. Some of them have even started groups to support people who have been in these groups, but have started to feel their own doubts and questions. This doesn't immediately change things, and the world won't suddenly be full of rainbows and unicorns. It takes a lot of work and time, and most importantly, relationship. And sometimes people don't change. There hasn't been some mass exodus of folks from these groups, but it can and does happen, and it does have an impact for us and our communities. And it begins caring with the people as individual human beings and treating them with the kindness and care that we hope for ourselves. As Adrienne Marie Brown says, small is all. It matters what we do and say. We need to stop name-calling and doing things that further separate and divide us. It makes a difference when we rehumanize those who have professed to hate us and people we love. First, we might want to widen and deepen our own community, but then we have to turn outward. It matters that those who we're trying to call back to the love we know believe that another world is not only possible, but also that they will be held in it if they do decide to consider crossing the divide. When we build bridges, we make it possible to heal the world and make all of us more whole. Every decision, every action should answer the question, what is love asking me to do now? Only love. Our entire faith is built on the belief that all of us, yes, even whoever it is that just popped into your mind, that all of us are held in an all-embracing love. May we go out into the world and live that love into life. Our closing hymn is formerly known as Standing on the Side of Love. The words were changed in 2016 by the author, the musician who wrote it, Jason Shelton, to Answering the Call of Love. The reason for this is because in 2016, our ministers began having a conversation about ableism within our faith. And while standing on the side of love can be used as a metaphor, it is often also used exclusively as a way to express how we are embodying our practices. Sitting has a very long history of being important to civil rights and other actions, and yet there are no songs about that, right? So Jason, when he heard these concerns, started thinking, what do I do? How do I make this song be something else? And he thought about it, and he thought about it, and he realized that standing on the side of love actually limited the way that he was thinking about what he wanted to convey, and that answering the call of love, was more all embracing for all people, regardless of how they live in their bodies, and meant more about how he wanted us to think about love.